Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Thursday, February 6, 2025. I'm Dr. Umonja Smalls, Director of Professional Development for Maryland Department of Health's Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to today's Rate Review Advisory Group meeting. Before beginning our meeting, we want to ensure civility for all of our meetings. The free expression of diverse viewpoints is an essential value for our group. This freedom comes with the responsibility to engage respectfully, which involves treating one another with dignity and respect in good faith. Uncivil behavior, disruptive conduct, abusive language, threats, or harassment will not be tolerated and may lead to being excused from the meeting. Thank you for helping to keep this productive and comfortable for everyone. All participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options to hear the webinar, by computer and by phone. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube and the DDA's website. Today's PowerPoint will be available to you to download from the DDA website and is also available for you to download from the materials section. If you are an attendee and have questions, please place them in the question box, which is a small icon with a question mark on it. During the public comment section of today's presentation, the DDA team will respond to questions that are posted, but also provide an opportunity for you to ask your questions directly by us calling on your name. And now I'd like to introduce Deputy Secretary Marlena Hutchinson to begin today's meeting. Good afternoon, Marlena.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Smalls, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first RX meeting of 2025. We are really excited about this upcoming rate review cycle, and we definitely extend our gratitude to each of you for dedicating your time and commitment to this crucial process. As we always say, and we feel your presence is sincerely appreciated, and we really value the significant contributions that each of you bring to our discussions. Next slide. So just to go over DDA's vision and mission, I'm not going to read this to you all, but just a reminder that the advisory group is a part of our structured implementation to further our rates and our commitment to the development of adequate and sustainable rates that promote the vision and mission of DDA. Your commitment and your willingness to work with us ensures an open and transparent process to review our rates. Next slide. Today's agenda will include our approach and priorities for calendar year 2025. We're specifically talking about employment services, the GL template, and then we would love to have more conversation and open dialogue as we did at our strategy meeting. Now I'll turn it over to Robert to go into the RAG meeting.
Thank you, Marlena. Good afternoon, RAG members and members of the public. Members were sent an email with meeting minutes on August 15th. As chair, I will make a motion to approve the minutes. Would a member like to second?
Robert, is Chris. I'll make a motion to second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Now I would like to turn it over to Steve Schramm from Hilltop to discuss our approach to this rate setting cycle. Steve?
Great, thank you, Robert. So if we can go to the next slide. So we've allocated about 30 minutes to talk about employment services today, and then Alice will be talking about the GL template. For the employment services conversation, the first couple of slides, so Dr. Smalls, you can go to the next slide, are going to be background slides. We're going to cover some of the issues that were discussed in the RAG strategy meeting. And so some of these first slides on employment services will be a recap of what we talked about. I want to make certain that we level set through these recap slides so that everyone is on the same page. So this first slide goes through what we talked about at the RAG strategy meeting, where we discussed DDA's approach to employment services. You can think of these as guiding principles that we want to make certain that we are considering as we look at the employment services and determine which of the rates we're going to review for the calendar year 25 priority. Based on a very robust discussion at the RAG strategy meeting, the group determined that the calendar year 25 priority for employment services would be follow along supports. You see this noted at the bottom of slide 10. So what we talked about during the meeting were services that potentially have challenges associated with those, and which would be the most appropriate for DDA to invest their resources in. DDA presented the reasoning behind proposing follow-along supports. We heard from Karen Lee about national trends in employment services, and as a result, the group chose follow-along supports. Next slide. We discussed this briefly at the last meeting. I wanted to make certain that this slide was included within today's presentation so that we can establish a baseline. What this slide does is it focuses on the process that we have put in place to do rate review on a service by service basis. What we do is we outline the 6 steps that we want to walk through throughout the course of any given year's rate setting cycle to ensure that we are doing a comprehensive review of the service in question. We have begun the conversations around policy and context. We will continue some of those conversations today, and then hopefully we will have a robust conversation today around process and potentially data. Note that the last 2 bullets, the actual formal proposal for change to follow along supports and the outcomes that we are targeting are not on the agenda for conversation today. We think those will be more appropriate for later conversations, but we wanted to map out how we were going to approach the rate review. Next slide, please. So this is the last of the recap slides. And what it does is it provides the same links that we provided during the RAG strategy meeting to the current policy. And then it allows us to have a conversation about the context to see if there are additional items that RAG members would like to provide any additional feedback before we get into the next step of the conversation. So with that, I'm going to open it to the group. Is there any additional conversation or feedback about Maryland's work in employment services or follow along supports or the national context for employment services?
This is Karen. I don't know the function on here to raise my hand. I'm sorry if it's here and I don't see it. This is new to me. But so one thing I was thinking about is we were told that we would get a copy of that MOU. I think there is some very creative ways that we could work within what DOOR's current funding paradigm is. Like, we don't normally, you have to exhaust all doors before you start using Medicaid or VR dollars. I think there is some really creative ways. If we could see that memo, I think that would be really contractually helpful for us to be able to see what it is that you're thinking, because we don't have to do it the traditional way that we exhaust DD, doors, and then we do DD. I mean, there's definitely ways that we could be creative, but we don't know what it is you're proposing, and so that would be incredibly helpful to hear from people, or to know what you're thinking. And I think the more information we have, the better we'll be able to give you some ideas.
Sure. Karen Lee, thanks for that comment. Robert, can you provide some context?
Sure. Thank you, Karen. We've been in conversation with DOORS. They're the actual agency that, for lack of a better term, owns the MOU. So we're working with them to see what, if any, of the components can be shared. I can say we can't share the MOU itself, but we want to see if we can share an overview before it's been fully executed of what's in it.
So the other thing I did is I went deep into the data that's on Hilltop around employment, and looking at how many people are in Discovery 1, Discovery 2, Discovery 3. I used FY23 and FY24 data, and then I used the data that's available by month in FY25 to look at some of those trends. And while I did my own analysis, I think that I would love to hear from the team at Hilltop, who is far more skilled and qualified to talk to us a little bit about what those trends say about service use, and who's using them, how often they're using them, is there places they're not being used. I think that would be incredibly helpful. If that is not a part of today's discussion, I think that trend analysis would be incredibly helpful for us.
Karen Lee, thanks for the feedback. That is not a part of today's conversation, but we will take it and add it to the next conversation. We have in the follow-up meeting, as you see in the 6 steps, we have the opportunity to talk about data and analytics. And so we can do that in the next meeting.
This is Chris. I've got actually 2 questions. Robert, you had mentioned that you couldn't share the actual MOU with the group. Is that a confidentiality concern? I mean, eventually all the providers are going to be subject to it. I think it would, at some point want to see the details of it. I understand the draft phase of it.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, we're talking about sharing the MOU as a draft. And so it's a little bit, it's more complicated than we thought it would be. But like I said, we're having conversation with DOORS to see if anything in there we can share at this point in time, especially as it relates to, the scope, the things that are really important to this group to understand. So I'll be following up with the director that oversees that program after this meeting to see if we've heard back yet.
Yeah, I think they have to. I think they are talking with their attorneys right now. But as Robert said, we'll definitely share what we can as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you. And so my second question, actually, Steve, if you could, just some thoughts on slide 11, if you don't mind bouncing back to that real quick. So
Sure.
as we look at this approach to rate review, and I want to jump down to the section where it says data, determine if data are available to quantify the service challenges. And then the next one, combine proposed policy changes and data if available. I'm proposing that maybe there's an intermediate step in there that if we look into the data, try to quantify and look at that process, and the data is not available, that we take an approach of focusing on how do we implement that data collection moving forward so that we're not dealing with a proposal and then data if available. I mean, and every time we do one of these, that should be part of our approach. If we don't have the data or access to the data, what are we doing to correct that piece of it?
Yeah, Chris, I like that ad. Thank you for clarifying that. The way we've done this in the past, this tends to be an iterative process, but it also has loops in it. We go back and we learn more each step. And so in the past, sometimes what we've done is during the process step, we've gone and had to um, review the policy again, and I'm very comfortable adding that loop in for the data, both a retrospective but also prospectively to potentially modify the GL template so that we have data to make the policy decision, but also data in the future to do the evaluation of the outcomes.
Absolutely what I was looking for. Thank you, sir.
No worries. Um, One of the other very specific questions I wanted to ask the group, and because this is virtual, I may actually call on people. I apologize. It's much easier to do this in person. You can see people leaning forward in their seat and they want to talk. It's not as easy virtually. But one of the things that we wanted to ask about was, did anyone have additional thoughts on national trends in employment services that can help inform our discussion before we move on to some of the scenarios that represent current challenges? Okay, so this is where Steve gets to be mean and heartless and start calling on people. I'm going to start with Karen Lee.
I'm in Silver Spring and I can look out the door and I can actually see DC, and I can tell you I have no idea what's happening down there that could change our trends at any single moment. And if you think that we have any kind of insight into the possible future of what's happening, it's the uncertainty of everything. I will just say that we are partners with many federal agencies where people we support work, and they're told not to talk about their disability. It's crazy talk down here. So I think that we have um, national things happening around what we're trying to do. Before this administration came in, we were looking at national policy that stopped the use of 14C. Of course, not an issue here in Maryland. But also there was some money in the reconciliation to bring forward competitive integrated employment and greater training into the states. That bill didn't pass, but there was some pretty significant um, support for that on both sides of the aisle. So that may come back, including a center to help increase the access and capacity for states to do competitive integrated employment. So I think that it's in these tumultuous times, considering that our president just a week ago blamed somebody with a disability for that horrific crash. I think that there's a lot of people who are keeping voices low around this support and service right now, but it does not necessarily stop our work going forward. That's what I would add.
Gotcha. Thank you. Laura, any thoughts or comments on the national context for follow-along supports?
Thank you. I don't have comments regarding data. I think the comments I would make is in terms of moving forward, and I'm sorry I missed the last meeting, so this may have been covered, but that just as a goal, and I think consistent with federal, or as Karen pointed out, who knows where we're going, but historically, CMS guidance, we need to really figure out how to move forward in a way that supports flexibility, because employment tends to require for many people more flexibility in when and how they get supports, and then being able to support people with different support levels for employment. And I think that tackling rates and the waiver are going to go hand in hand.
Great. Thank you for the feedback. Greg, anything?
It's a good question, and as I thought about that, I thought back a decade or so where north of the border, the most lucrative job you could have as a provider was helping somebody look for work. And in that process, you had people continually looking for work. But once placement occurred, the rug got pulled out from under them in terms of support and funding. And so, and that has evolved over time. I just think that we need to look at, as with all things, what the preferred outcome is and how this system supports that preferred outcome. And my concern is, and we see this in other, not to go too political, but we see this in other services too, is when people succeed, all of a sudden there's an idea that they don't need that anymore, and it gets pulled out from under them. And the reason they're succeeding is because they have that support. I think employment is no different. And I just would hope that our system would support that outcome.
Great. Thanks, Greg. If everyone's comfortable, I'm going to have us jump to slide 13. So
Hey, Steve,
slide
it's
13.
David. Can you
Yep,
hear me? Yeah, sorry.
absolutely.
You skipped ahead. I don't know why you did that, but I would add one more sort of complexity to the pile. There is zero doubt that whether it comes in the form of work requirements and or block granting of Medicaid, which will have a direct, and I don't mind the use of hyperbole, devastating impact on the availability of Medicaid resources to Marylanders whose employment supports might come after doors sort of checks out through HCBS. And so in an environment in which resources are going to get far skinnier, not heavier, that, where federal policy is going is not a question of if, but really rather a question of when, if we're reading anything close to the tea leaves, number one. And number two, it occurs to me, therefore, that we should be positioning ourselves as a state to maximize some posturing around protecting as much as we possibly can, and then creating a system that in fact maximizes what is then available in match.
Great. Thank you for that feedback. Appreciate it. Anyone else before we jump to slide 13? So I've allocated the bulk of the time for the employment services conversation for slide 13. It's where we're going to talk about process and data. Thank you, David. Appreciate it. We would like, if the RAG members are comfortable, to have a discussion about 3 to 5 actual situations where you can describe a scenario that you deal with day to day, where the current follow along support, service, and associated rate does not meet the needs of your organization. And the idea behind having those anecdotal examples is to see if we can begin to identify what the challenges are and if there are any themes in those challenges. And so we had requested that any of the participants in the RAG strategy meeting be prepared to give us an example or two of where in their agency the follow-along supports is not working as effectively as it could, so that we can talk about some of the challenges. So I don't know how to use the raise the hand feature in this program either. So I am just going to open it up to the group. And if I don't get anyone to jump up with a example, I will call on people.
I, I can share how that rate was developed because I was at the table for that, and if that would be helpful for people.
Very helpful.
Okay. So when these rates are developed, we tend to look, of course, this is follow along, this is not ongoing. Let's make sure that we separate them. So this is for people who get drop-in supports, and they get those drop-in supports that are um, checking with your supervisor, checking with the person. A lot of times the person might say, please don't come to my employer. You have to meet me at Safeway, or meet me at Starbucks and we'll talk or something. Um, and so a lot of this is oftentimes case management. When we need to do more intense services because they have a new supervisor, they have new tasks at their job, their company moves, something like that, we oftentimes slip back into ongoing supports if they have more intense needs other than just kind of drop in and checking up on them. As Greg said, that support that's there for people when they're once they're successful, that they need to keep going with. And what we did is we kind of looked at what the original caseload would be like. So for a traditional job coach that's kind of going from place to place to place to meeting people. Now this is, again, not ongoing support, not somebody who needs intensive supports, but really just kind of that how you doing, checking in kind of support. We looked at caseloads of like 15 people per job coach that they're checking in on once or twice a month to see how they're doing. And so it was done kind of based on that, knowing what we're paying job coaches and how many hours. The piece that was not considered, and I think that this is the biggest piece, is that when you're doing these kinds of case management supports for people and checking in with their employer and all that kind of stuff, you get a lot of phone calls from those people that say to you, hey, I got this benefits letter and I need some help with that. And then you're doing, 2-3 hours a week for a couple of weeks to help them solve the benefits issue. So when I brought up last meeting that for every hour of direct, there's generally 3 hours of indirect to support these folks. That's the piece that did not get added onto the rate. So it was based on really the direct hours with a caseload that's kind of normal for somebody who's doing this kind of drop in. But it really missed the components and the amount of time that providers spend in indirect time supporting somebody to help them to negotiate and navigate the systems. Oftentimes people who receive these types of services, they get a lot less services in the rest of their day, right? So these are not people who are getting that have other resources in their lives to get support, and so they are using, help me to figure out how to get my, my bus stuff taken care of, and help me figure out, I need new uniforms for work, or I need to, qualify for doors, or I need to talk to benefits. So I think that the piece that ended up being missed here was the indirect time. And so I think that, to me, that's the biggest component, is that it was based on direct hours. It did not have the indirect hours that we use as the safety net, as was brought up before, to make sure people continue with their jobs.
Very helpful. Any other comments? Go ahead, Donna.
So I would agree totally with Karen. I mean, that's what we experience here. There's very few people we support where the follow along is simply just the follow along. It's really about that person in their life, and they don't always need things necessarily throughout the entire year, but when they do need things, it can be very taxing in terms of time, and it is all of the indirect things. And that was not considered when that rate was developed, and I think it's a really crucial piece that is missing.
So great feedback. Thank you, Donna. I'm trying to follow the conversation. So, Donna or Karen, would you give a couple more examples? I'm taking notes of the indirect service. You mentioned things like benefits questions. Can you give a couple more examples just to help us flesh it out?
Well, even if someone loses their transportation for 2 or 3 days for whatever reason, and now they call you, I've got to get to work, and you can't coordinate something, now you have to go get them and take them to work. Or we have a gentleman we support who's very independent, but he got a letter about his rent and an eviction, and he was worried and wanted to take the day off. He needed somebody to help him take care of that very quickly. It's just day-to-day things that you and I deal with all the time, that while these people are independent and very independent with their job, these things come up, and you are their lifeline for all of those things to help them. But even times on the job, if you just have the follow-along service, there may be other things that they need as well. But it's not just a check on them and then you're gone and that's it. And we're finding that. And the longer you have that relationship with those people and the longer they have those jobs, you're the person that they need those supports from. So, and they are indirect. You can't necessarily add up the time or say it's going to require this much time every month. But there needs to be a factor in there for it.
Great.
I lost my
Very
bank
helpful.
card. I lost my bank card, and how am I going to get my cash out? And if I don't have my cash, I can't pay for the bus today, or however I'm getting to work. And I think the other piece that it's really important that you're hearing the things that Donna and I are saying is a lot of times our employment support for these folks are keeping them out of more expensive long-term residential supports, right? And not that there are people who don't get residential or more intense supports, but you find that people who are in this category of support, who are getting kind of drop-in work support, that's probably also what they're getting at home. They're probably not getting, I think we'd have to look at the numbers, but my gut says to me that this is a lifeline support, as Donna said. I think that's a really good use of words, is that, I got to make a doctor's appointment because they told me I have to have a TB test and I have no idea how to ask my doctor for that. Can you help me create an online account so I can do? So we're doing really kind of typical case management, is what I would say is the kinds of supports that people want and need, that maybe a more intense, somebody who gets more intense supports might be getting from somebody else. But this is oftentimes the lifeline support that they're getting.
Okay.
And Steve, if I could add, well, I don't have anything different. This is Karen Adams-Gilchrist with Providence. I don't have anything different than what Karen, Lee, and Donna were saying, but I do wanted to say, I kind of ditto everything that they're saying. It is really just life. It's life. People are lifing, and those little things, and it can be the tiniest little thing that can pop up that then throws someone off, and you've got to spend time assisting them to be able to be in their job and to be successful. And it happens on a daily basis, and it is all of those indirect things that just simply happens in life. And that's kind of, and I think we have gotten very comfortable in just doing it because it requires us to do it in order for them to be successful. But it is not something that is covered and not something that people think about, but it is simply a part of life and what happens in life. So.
Great.
Steve,
Very
it's
helpful.
Chris. I'll just add a thought to that as well too. I mean, Karen was talking. Any change in routine for that individual, whether it's I'm signing up for health insurance, my bus card is not working, my paycheck, something happened to, any change in that daily routine could warrant additional supports at any given moment. And then on top of that, consider the factor that the level of supports for an individual could be quite different. Helping one individual fix their issue with their banking and their bus card versus another individual could be completely different level of intensity of supports that are needed, embedded in addressing that particular issue. But any change in routine absolutely could warrant today I need help.
Gotcha. So on this discussion today, you know, we can artificially distinguish between process and data, but it is truly artificial. So are you all comfortable if I just ask, for these examples, would there be a way to have the individual that's providing the follow along supports to document these kinds of assistance via phone calls, those kinds of things?
We do. They're all in our system. Every time they have an interaction with somebody in our organization, their case manager is actually documenting that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Their
there's
Should
a
their
that be
job coach.
reported out, Karen?
Um, I don't know if it's by hour because it's a milestone service, but certainly the frequency of them is documented, but maybe not the timeline isn't documented. But we could do it going
Okay.
forward, just if you wanted to see what those look like.
Yeah. Okay.
And Steve, I think there's value in looking to it. It's sometimes there's those general supports that you may not allocate directly to one individual. You have an employment team that's out building relationships and working and looking
Gotcha.
for jobs. How do you allocate that
Yep.
across the board? Which is one of the data questions for me.
Okay.
Steve, I would make a recommendation. um, Maryland has a relationship with SELN. It's a Supported Employment Leadership Network, operated by NASDs and the University of Massachusetts Boston. They actually have an app that job coaches use to track this stuff. And Oliver, who is the lead on that, is somebody who is on the Maryland team, I believe. So they actually have this app. I know that some Maryland providers did participate. I think Penmar did. I know Seek did, participated in their pilot that captured this. So they may actually already have that data for us. And I know they've written a couple papers on it.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, to Karen's point, Steve, we should be able to grab some of that data. Stephanie Jones from our team is actually engaged in that.
Perfect. Okay. So, I have to ask this question. The indirect hours are not covered by any other agency or provider. There's not an alternative funding source.
No.
no.
Okay. Great. All right. Can I bring us back to an issue that was brought up in the RAG strategy meeting? I'm honestly unable to attribute it to a particular individual, but I know we talked about it. Someone brought up the idea that depending upon how long someone had been in the service, they had different needs. Um, is there a need for us to differentiate how long an individual has been in service or the type/level of job that they're in for follow-along supports?
I think, Steve, what we were talking about is the model in Wisconsin from the managed care organization, and it was actually the number of hours that they work per week. Their matrix, which um, Rick Callahan here in Maryland led a work group of people around this very issue, and we did a lot of studying of that rate model, and maybe even I can get Rick to share some of that information at some point. But it was the they did use an acuity level. I think they have a four-step acuity level, but then it's the amount of the rate was determined by the acuity level or the needs of the person according to whatever mechanism or testing that they use. But it was the number of hours a week the person works. So if you're working only 2 hours a week, you shouldn't get the same follow along dollars that somebody who's working 15 hours, 20 hours, or 40 hours a week is getting. But then what they also did was they increased the rate based on the person's longevity as an incentive to the provider to ensure that the person kept their job. So it was actually an incentive payment. It wasn't based on on the length of job in terms of in relation to the person, but it was an incentive to providers to fund them at a higher rate for helping somebody keep their job longer. So it had those three factors in it, the organization, and I think they ended up getting bought up by a bigger managed care organization, and the larger managed care organization actually adopted this company's might have been CareSource. I'm not sure, but I can definitely find it.
Okay. We have just a couple minutes left on the follow along supports discussion. I'm curious if individuals from the RAG have feedback on the hours worked, the acuity, and the incentive for longevity. Any feedback from the group?
Steve, can I just jump in? I actually had just one comment in follow up to Karen's comments, and I think Karen would concur with us. I'm not sure, but one of the things that's interesting to me is that we had an older model in Maryland that did kind of fund outcomes essentially. Somebody had a job, the provider was paid, and we moved away from that at the same time that from my networks across the country, I hear states are actually looking, somewhat similarly to what Karen's describing, to moving to the model that we moved away from. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. There may be ways to make that kind of payment for kind of successful employment while making sure we don't create incentives that backfire, which is possible. That we, look at that. So.
Thank you, Laura. Actually, and hopefully I'm not putting words in David's mouth, but during the last meeting, when the conversation about paying for outcomes was brought up, and outcomes being longevity in the job, complexity of the job, and the number of hours per week, he was very supportive of those kinds of outcomes being the target for payment. Okay, so I don't want to take too much of Alice's time for the general ledger template, but I want to just wrap up a little bit. So Karen Lee, you had mentioned that you thought on potentially at least some portion, if not a significant portion, of the indirect contact could be captured in some way within your case management system. So I think it would be interesting for us to talk about how that could inform our conversation going forward. And
Yeah, I
it
would
sounds
definitely check
like,
with that data. I would actually
yep,
look at the data from the job coach app and
yep,
see if that does it, if that differentiates it.
yep. Um, and I can add the job coach app. The other piece that I want to throw out is this idea of including some outcomes based payment as part of the follow along supports. I think that's intriguing. We all know that there are constraints in Maryland because of the current budget situation, but if we could figure out a way to align incentives so that we are paying for better outcomes, I think that would be desirable if we were to make changes to the rates. Before I pivot to the next slide, which is just where we're going to go in the future, and I am not convinced we're done with the process and data conversation. So I just want to be very clear with that. We need to continue to flesh this out. Any other questions or comments or feedback on the follow along supports conversation? Okay.
Steve,
So,
can I just wonder if at some point, and again, if you covered it in the last meeting, my apologies, the issue of flexibility at some point needs to be kind of a specific discussion because from what we hear, it definitely comes up a lot in terms of people needing flexibility based on people's work schedules, losing a job, gaining a job, and being able to make those moves quickly enough so that people are supported and are able to take those jobs when they're offered and then have the support they need if they happen to lose a job.
so Laura, are you comfortable if I push a little bit and ask for? I love the concept of flexibility. I need a little bit more. Help me understand what you mean. So, would flexibility in your eyes represent um, a um, an add-on if someone lost their job? Help me try
Right.
to express flexibility in terms of a rate component for me.
Yeah, so this is why I said it's kind of a marriage of rate and waiver because and billing system. So how you kind of just pull out the rate piece is tough. But I know we have had a lot of feedback about um, again, employment is one of those areas where the the predictability of a schedule can be tough for some people. They work a 9 to 5, 5 days a week, or you know 12 to 4, 3 days a week, whatever it is, and it's pretty dependable. But there are certainly a number of people for whom, in addition to the examples that providers gave about things just coming up where a provider needs to kind of jump in, and it doesn't really fall under follow along. It doesn't follow under ongoing. So there is that piece. And that to me could potentially be addressed through a specific rate adjustment or option for billing, potentially. But uh, what happens is people are offered a job, and let's say it's retail, and to get the job they have to be able to take it. It's a Friday and they need to be able to start on Monday or Tuesday. If 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 they can't access those supports quickly enough, they may have to say, we hear examples of people having to say, well, it's going to take 4 weeks for it to be approved, and therefore, either the provider does it and doesn't provides the support and doesn't get paid, or the person can't take the job.
Gotcha.
Neither one's right. So that kind of thing. And then just on the kind of the other end, if somebody suddenly gets fired, where the flexibility is needed is to be able to kind of immediately provide the meaningful day or CDS, whatever those daytime supports are, so that they hopefully aren't left with a gap. And so it's really, you know what I mean? It's kind of the whole piece. It's rates, it's the waiver, it's the billing structure.
Great.
But
Thank
also
you.
the
Steve,
but also the approval process and the cumbersome nature of the approve. It's about the um, fluidity of the approval process and the amount of time it takes to get it done. So when somebody has a life-changing situation, how fast can the system adjust?
yeah.
Yeah, when I said billing structure, yes, that you're correct. I had all of that in my head. Yep.
Steve, it's Chris. I think what popped into my head is we need some kind of a flexible transition mechanism, whether it's initial onboarding for the job, change in job structure, or some other situation that warrants additional supports during a period of time that gives us that flexibility that we may be between services as they are defined now.
This
Chris, how
is
do you see that? How do you see that differently than ongoing? Because I see that's what we use ongoing for.
I think there's definitely situations that I think that skirt the definition of what we would consider ongoing. And I think, Karen, my point was really more it's the immediate ability to access that flexibility, which right now we're all saying, even if we ongoing was a good enough answer and that was the solution. How do we get from A to B? And is there a
Yeah.
mechanism or
Okay.
a temporary funding in between that would give us that transition piece?
You have to ask for that money ahead of time as a safety net, and it's not always being approved right now is part of the, I
Right.
think, part of the flexibility issue. And what it is it is oftentimes your safety net for people.
And then we get into
So this
over
is
authorizations and funding and all that. Because of the rigidity of the system, we tend to try and want as much as we can get so that we have that flexibility, and that's not helping the long-term cause.
This is great feedback on policy. I'm sure Stephanie is taking copious notes, and we want to make certain that the policy provides you the support and the flexibility to meet individuals' needs. I'm going to have us jump to the very next slide. As I mentioned previously, this slide 14 is not on the agenda for today. This will be 2 or 3 meetings down the road. And it will be iterative like we talked about. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Alice so that she can address the GL template training.
Great, thanks, Steve. So I am here. Kristen is off today, but she is listening. So she usually leads the general ledger, but I will try my best to pitch in today and fill in for her. So just as a recap, in 2023, DDA established the general ledger template as the data collection tool to support rates going forward. And DDA really wanted us to make sure that there was a strong focus on ensuring that adequate provider resources and technical assistance were provided to make sure that these were filled out correctly. And so this is really our core piece to make sure that we have the data we need to make those data-driven decisions. So we've had lots of opportunities for technical assistance and to access resources in advance of the fiscal 24 general ledger template deadline. We opened that conversation a year ago at the January strategy meeting, or I'm sorry, last month at the general strategy meeting, and challenged the RRAG members to engage with your peers, provider groups, stakeholders to solicit feedback on what technical assistance would be helpful going forward. So a quick update on where we are. The templates that were due September 30th, the fiscal 24, we've got almost 80% with at least an initial submission in, but still awaiting about 20% of providers to send those in. So our Hilltop team, we've got a systematic review of all of these templates, and we're working closely with Optimus as well to make sure we've got kind of all the data in the right spot and it's looking the way it's supposed to look. We have 2 analysts looking at each and every submission. And then we are doing a process where we're reaching out to every provider and providing them feedback and then requests for edits as needed. So we're providing that targeted feedback to ensure consistency between the templates and make sure there's high quality data. So we've had a lot of one-on-one provider calls. So if you've participated in those, thanks so much. And then a lot of emails back and forth requesting written clarification. So this resubmission process is really where we are right now to improve the year 1 data and make sure that providers can adjust and make sure they're ready to report with their fiscal 25 data. So for the rest of this calendar 25, we really want to continue this process. We're going to spend the next 7 or 8 months doing this to make sure we are ready for the next deadline. And so we really want to get your feedback about the right type of assistance at the right time. We want to make sure we're setting ourselves up to have the highest quality data from 100% of providers by September 30th of this year. So we want to make the best use of our time to achieve it. So we will continue to have providers have direct access to our team at Hilltop. We have a dedicated Hilltop email address for that. And so we encourage providers to reach out to us anytime. We can provide one-on-one technical assistance. And at this point, we have met one-on-one with over 40 providers. Next slide, please. And so we talked about this a little bit last month, and I'm sorry that David Irvin had to drop because we had a good conversation with him to really talk about peer-to-peer technical assistance and what this might look like. So we want to make sure that David's team is ready and available to meet with providers to talk through any data points, share experiences related to completing the template. We've talked about potentially providing some office hours, so where Hilltop and David's finance person who feels pretty confident with the template could get on. Providers could drop in, request assistance, and just kind of talk through any issues there are. I was going to have David jump in, but since he's not here, he kind of noted that sometimes it feels like just getting started is the hardest part. And so talking to providers and letting them know how the GL is very similar to the cost reports, how they can kind of crosswalk from the cost reports. You did this before when you did this last year. This is how it kind of maps to the general ledger template. Might be helpful just to hear from somebody in the community, a provider who's done it before. So we want to ask you about timing for the peer-to-peer engagement with the office hours work. Are there other ideas? And we also are looking for other volunteers who might want to help, who feel like they have a good handle on the general ledger template. So please reach out to us directly if you'd like to do that. So as we've been reviewing templates and engaging providers with feedback, we're tracking clarifications, common areas, frequent problems that we're seeing, and targeted comments on resources from providers. And we really appreciate the time and energy of the provider community to collect and report this data. So we want to really streamline and build efficiency. So we are looking to schedule additional trainings with options to attend as well as view recorded sessions. So we're planning on recording as much as we can. And we wanted to also ask about specific requests for topics to cover during the training sessions. For example, we have heard specifically on providers that facility costs are kind of tricky. And so we know we're going to have a specific training on this specific issue, but if there are other ideas or other places you think we should focus, please let us know. So maybe I'll pause here for a minute and see if there's anything anybody wanted to jump in with before I keep going.
Alice, can I just jump in and say,
Yeah.
I think everybody who, I think you all have done a good job of, trying to provide as much support to providers as you can. The first year is really tough, and my hope is that it gets better moving forward. It is, if I had to rank the things that I have heard the most about in the last year, from a kind of painful perspective, the struggles with completing the template is probably up there. So I don't know, how we can get at some of that. I know, our actuary, has spent some time looking at it as well. So I don't know if there's a way for us to actually have a discussion about it or not. But I do think, again, I think you guys are really trying to support people. And when people have reached out, they've found that with the Hilltop staff, they've found that helpful. But I still, even yesterday, had a conversation with a provider about what should and shouldn't be included in residential and why, and that some people included some things and others didn't, and what that means for, data analysis. So I just wanted to say, I think it is still a pain point for providers. And, we're certainly happy to try to help figure out if there's some way to make this work better so that everybody gets better data.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments, Laura. I wonder if you're saying that you're suggesting changes to the template or just kind of better annotation for each box, like this is what goes here.
It might be a little bit of both. I would need to, kind of dive into it more with members. I just know kind of in all of the conversations that where people have raised it, they've, expressed that they have found it really challenging. And a lot of it, look, providers range from really small or new, and providers that are have very, really sophisticated, strong systems in place. We kind of run the gamut. And even the providers that have really sophisticated, sharp, systems, sharp staff who get complicated things, I've heard from them as well with the struggles. So, you know what I mean? It's not just if we could just get the training right. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but I do know this has definitely been something. And, we want there to be better data. So, that's why we'd like to help.
Yeah,
Also,
that's great. I mean, oh, go ahead.
Alice, and I think you may have said it, I'm not sure, but in sort of in line with what Laura was just saying is if there are assumptions or nuances or whatever that you're finding as you guys are analyzing the data, would be great for the provider community to know those nuances and those assumptions, because we struggle with we're doing it this way, and we hope that everybody else is doing it this way too. Hoping that whatever we find out from everybody that has submitted data, that it will help to improve the quality and the validity of the data. But we certainly struggle that these are the assumptions that we're making, but we have no idea, did everybody else make those same assumptions? Did everybody else do this the same way? And it would be helpful if you're finding those things to somehow share that back with us, so that as we're updating and doing these again, that we're all doing it, comparing apples to apples, so that the data is valid and it's good quality data.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I think we definitely want it to be consistent and want it to be apples to apples. We have asked providers, where you're not sure, just put it in the description, tell us where you put something. And so I think we're still kind of going through that process to see, well, 40% of you did it this way, 20% of you did it this way. And, and so figuring out where all of that should fall. So I think as we have more data, we can give more feedback about what would be best. But that being said, I mean, I think we would rather have people fill it out and take your best guess and just tell us where you put certain dollars. So I think all of that's really helpful. I think our goal is really to get 100% everybody to submit something, right? So everybody's taken a first cut at it, because I think just taking that first leap and getting it filled out is really important. And then we'll at least have a baseline. We'll have everybody in. Others will be further along, of course, than some others. And then we can really look to see who needs a lot more assistance to get us to the next submission. So Laura, Karen, looking forward to kind of talking with you guys more. If you hear other things, and certainly we'll continue to work with David, but I'm hoping that we can just send, for the 80% we haven't heard from, we're hoping to just send kind of some direct emails and have some direct time with that group just to get them launched. Any other comments or observations about this? Okay, we can go to the next slide. So I won't spend a ton of time on this, but we do have a lot of resources already available. I think for some groups that are just starting, the groups that are very small, this might be kind of overwhelming, but it all is here. So when groups are ready to start, I think this is a good place to start. We have the instructions document, the sample template, a lot of FAQs that we're building as we go. That dedicated email address is there. And then, of course, we also have the one-on-one technical assistance available all the time. So I know we are a little short on time, so I'll stop here and turn it back to Robert.
Before Robert jumps in, Alice, I'm going to ask the RAG members to do a little bit of homework. So, could the RAG members work on um, the each of you as an RAG member is intended to represent a larger group of providers, so not just your own interests. Could you individually begin to develop a list of priorities for the training? What I mean by that is the residential instruction section needing the most work? Is it the allowable versus unallowable cost section in general that needs the most work? At some point, we need to take this conversation with the GL template from theoretical to very practical. And I want to begin to schedule meetings, and I want to have specific topics identified. And so if at the next meeting you can bring a list of topics where you think training is most needed, we can begin to build a training schedule. Robert, back to you.
Thank you, Steve. So we're getting ready to pivot to the open discussion, but before we do so, just as a reminder, as I mentioned at the last strategy session, we will be scheduling separate meetings with members of the RRAG to discuss cost containment and long-term sustainability of the program as we continue to also collaborate with the governor's office and DBM. The first meeting, including members of the RRAG, is scheduled for tomorrow from 2 to 3 p.m. You should have already received the invitation to that meeting. It would have come through Constant Contacts, so please check your spam folders. If you have not received the invitation, please reach out to Elizabeth and she'll ensure you get the correct link. Okay, so turning it over to you all for open comment period before we go into the public session.
Robert, it's Chris. Just as we continue to go through this process, knowing that the budgetary issues with the state are kind of hanging over as a black cloud here, that there is consideration if changes come, if funding decreases come, that there's consideration given to them to the integrity of the work that we've been doing for the last decade to try and restructure here. One significant change without any impact or thought of impact on the overall product, we might be jumping back 10 years and starting over again.
Thanks for that feedback, Chris.
Any other walk-on items or discussion points? So, just this chat. We are ready for public comments.
Okay, well, we got quite a few comments in our question box. Um, would you like me to read those questions, or do we want to call on folks to have them read their question aloud? Robert, what would you prefer?
Why don't we call on folks if they want to, come on mic? Um, Otherwise, you can read the question aloud if they don't want to.
Okay. Well, then our first person is Rick Broyles, and I do apologize in advance if I pronounce your name incorrectly. So Rick, we're going to unmute you so that you can ask your question aloud if you'd like.
Okay, I had a couple of things that I threw in the chat. Just the first would be additional to your indirect urgent needs or workplace issue. What if they end up in an argument with a coworker or an accident happens? And when discussing these rates, have you thought about having somebody from go through a roster of somebody's employees and have them come talk to you? Don't let the ARC send a representative because I feel like they would be coached, but let's pick somebody that works at the ARC and ask them to come tell us what's going on, or doors. And my last thing was, how quickly can someone access supports if they are to lose their job and need to deal with job searching and unemployment case and all of that?
Thank you for your feedback related to the first two bullet points. As far as the question related to supports, we have an SLA, so if you needed to revise your person-centered plan because your needs have changed, let's say you've got a job and now you need to follow along, our internal SLA is 5 days. However, we do know that we have to work on that it is taking longer than the 5 days. But ideally, that process should take around 5 business days.
And just a point of clarification, SLA means service level agreement. So basically what that means is my team is required to process within those 5 days that Robert mentioned for those emergency kind of requests. Next question.
Next question. I think we have time for one more.
Okay, our next question is from Daniela Boradale, and I do apologize if I pronounced your name incorrectly. Looks like she's made a comment, which is great. She says, agreed. I think methodology of how each agency is connecting data would be helpful. Sorry, let me get to a question. Laura Lair. Laura Lear, if you'd like to read your question, you can unmute yourself. If not, I'll read your question for you.
Dr. Smalls, given the fact that we have less than a minute, would you please read the question?
Sure. Is employment follow along only priority for the RAG this year? What about other priorities that were identified last year and not addressed?
So yes, employment services has been a priority for multiple rate cycles. And last year we did hear about other priorities. And as we were having discussions during strategy sessions, we landed on employment services, specifically follow along supports. And that's because we have limited resources and bandwidth, obviously, to deal with multiple priorities any given cycle, but also because employment services, for lack of a better term, has been kicked from one cycle to the next. And I think we're at a point where we have to address those rates in alignment with our vision of becoming or being an employment first state.
So Dr. Smalls, we are at time. Let's do our closing remarks, please. So for everyone's situational awareness, our next REG meeting is scheduled for March 6th. Panel members will, and REG members will receive the information in advance of the next meeting, and we will also invite the public. Next slide, please. This is just the slide that shows the remaining dates for this calendar year. Next slide, please. And this slide shows where you can find this year and previous years' REG information. Next slide, please. We want to thank everyone for your participation today, your commitment to work with us through this calendar year's process. We are also very much interested in working with you all, again, with the governor's proposed budget. We have sent the invitations to the REG members for tomorrow's meeting at 2 p.m. And we will have additional meetings with the REG members and other community partners to talk about the governor's proposed budget. More information is forthcoming. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.